Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming out this evening in Tullamore to hear me speak on this, and also welcome to everyone who is tuning in on Zoom. I'm delighted, really delighted to be here this evening at the invitation of the Offaly Historical and Archaeological Society. It's my first time in Tullamore, I think in about 4 or 5 years. This particular lecture fell victim to the pandemic, but it's great that we're able to go ahead with it now, not only in person, but also to those who are tuning in from all over the world, perhaps. And thanks to Ciarán McCabe for lots of correspondence back and forth over the last 2.5 years, actually, about this particular lecture. I've been researching Irish history, I suppose, in an academic way for about 12 or 13 years now. And over that time, I've received enormous help and support from people here in Offaly. Not least Diarmaid Bracken in the County Library, who assisted me while I was researching the book that will be the basis for this lecture this evening. Michael Byrne, of course, was enthusiastic about this project really from the get-go. He shared all his research with me. He allowed me to include original drawings in the book that I published. The study was an Ireland-wide one, Island of Ireland, north and south, of course. This is really kind of 18th, 19th century history. And it was great wherever there was extensive local research already done that I was able to use when I was trying to draw together a kind of a national picture. And that was definitely the case for Offaly, more so than for many counties, to be honest. I made a lot of use of the journal of the Society as I was carrying out my research. Michael Byrne's many publications on the history of the county and on Tullamore in particular. I felt, I suppose, always that Offaly's history was opened up to me without any caveats. I never got a kind of a, who's this guy from Cork and living in England, why is he interested in Offaly's buildings and all that. It was very, very warm and welcoming, and I really appreciated that as I was going around the country looking at buildings and visiting archives and libraries. I also want to say, just before I get into things, thanks to the really hard-working and I think often overlooked staff in the National Library in Dublin, who were hugely helpful to me throughout the many years I was working on this particular project. There were lots of drawings, for example, that they allowed me to go in and look at, in particular to Mary Broderick there. And we had great fun the day that there was a big collection of drawings opened up and we were trying to figure out what they were. And this was one of them, of the former prison in Tullamore. And we tried to make kind of a catalogue of those drawings. And that was before that part of the National Library closed for big renovations. Some of you probably will know the project I'm talking about. So it was great to be able to get in there before that work started. And finally, thanks to Andrew Tierney, who was mentioned in the introduction, who's been a good friend, fellow enthusiast for many years, equally keen as I am for Ireland's architectural heritage. And while I was researching courthouses and prisons, he was, of course, undertaking a much more onerous job of researching the Buildings of Ireland guide for Central Leinster, for Offaly and Laois, and then for Kildare afterwards, which was published to acclaim in 2019. And I wrote a review of it as well, and it was a pleasure to read and to review the book. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about some material from one of my own books, which is a little bit heavier, more unwieldy than Andrew's one, which is the Building the Irish Courthouse, A Political History book published by Cork University Press 2 years ago. It's available in all of the usual places, all the usual bookshops. It's just about €40 or so. It's a fine, big, hefty tome, 600 glossy pages. It's a fine doorstop, if nothing else. The book is really about, I suppose, how and why Ireland's courthouses and prisons were built roughly in the years between 1750 and 1850. That's when the vast majority of them were built in the towns and cities in Ireland that we see today, including, of course, in Tullamore. The real peak years were the 50 years between, say, the Great Rebellion and the famine. So that first half of the 19th century. And again, that's exactly when things are going here in Tullamore and in many other towns and cities throughout Ireland. I was very fortunate when I was working on this book to have lots of published material. I mentioned Michael Byrne's work and others, but also earlier work, Maurice Craig, Eddie McParland, Christine Casey, Alistair Rowan, and many others. And I suppose the more I researched the topic, what I wanted to write about was the major landlords in each county who were the patrons, essentially, of these buildings, and how and why they built these great buildings throughout Ireland in these years. The core group were known as grand juries. I'm sure many of you have come across that term before. The grand juries were the form of local government in Ireland before the establishment of county councils towards the end of the 19th century. They were the major landlords. They oversaw raising taxes in a county, major spending on roads and public buildings, and so on. They had their own very distinctive character, they had their own politics, and they were far from uncontroversial in these years. And many of them, for example, in the pre-famine years, had a very strong orange element to them. And seeing as today's the 12th of July, I mean, it's worth pointing out that there was a big politics to many of the grand juries of this time period. A typical grand jury was 23 men, selected by the High Sheriff of each county without any kind of democratic effort. And they met twice a year at what were known as the assizes to sort out the finances for each county, and also, and this is really where their name comes from, to decide on which cases should go forward for trial at the assizes. In these years, there were two juries. There was the grand jury that worked on indictments, and the petit jury that actually heard cases and decided on guilt as such. We really, I suppose, today think of the petit jury as the jury in a court case. But in America, for example, grand juries are still very much part of business, and they're always referenced in the news. And here's just one of the thousands of newspaper articles from this time period. This is from the Tralee Mercury about the goings-on at one of the Carlow assizes. Grand juries were awash with accusations of corruption in these years, including from the British government in Westminster. Too often money went amiss. Local roads adjoining big estates were repaired again and again and again, even if there was nothing left to repair, for example. Today, we obsess about terms like transparency, accountability, oversight, auditing, and so on and so on. But these are just not words that people would have used in the early 19th century. This is a whole different era, of course. Tenants often resisted paying these local taxes, the cess taxes, to the grand juries, in the same way as there was pushback in these years against paying tithes to the Church of Ireland, as many of you will know. This was also, though, a very messy world of power and money and politics, and it's hard to summarise in a few sentences what exactly was going on in these years. Just one sentence, one example of it is a book that some of you may know by Brendan McShrivna, The End of Outrage, published a few years ago by Oxford University Press, about Donegal, but it has lots of references to the grand juries in Donegal. The same men in his part of Donegal who were by day the road contractors for the Donegal grand jury were by night the white boys and the secret society groups that were being targeted by the police and the army. And so it's kind of a give and take. And that's not unusual in these years, but to give you some sense about how messy and how murky that the local politics could be. In general, as I mentioned, Irish grand jurors in these years were unionist, of course, in their politics. Many were scared by and scarred by the Great Rebellion of 1798. The British government needed these landlords, this grand jury system, and the grand juries needed the British government. It worked, again, both ways to keep the political settlement of the time going, but that doesn't mean that both sides agreed on everything. The British government, of course, helped grand juries financially, as they helped, for example, the Church of Ireland through the Board of First Fruits in these years. Though at times giving more money or loans to grand juries was like throwing fuel into the fire. Eventually, the British government reined in some of their extravagances, tempered some of their more occasional kind of sectarian outbursts, and demanded more accounts and more paperwork, and appointed inspectors, for example, to tour prisons and to call out abuses. All of this eventually called time on the freedoms that the grand jurors had, but not before they had managed to build and to rebuild some of the most impressive buildings that we have in Ireland today. And one of the arguments in my book is that the grand jurors didn't just build huge courthouses and prisons to show a political strength over, say, potential rebels in each county, though this was part of the story. They also tore down and replaced buildings because they wanted the best building. They wanted the biggest building, the most fashionable style, the best architect. They wanted a better building than their peers had in the next county, for example. Thus, when the grand jurors in Kerry built a new courthouse in Tralee, the Cork grand jurors essentially became jealous straight away and wanted the same, if not better, in Cork, and went ahead and built a new courthouse a few years later in Cork. Neighbouring counties sometimes built new jails at the same time, employing the same architect. In short here, I suppose what I'm trying to get at is a kind of consumerism, as much as it is about power and politics, as much a kind of I want it as I need it. And also, and particularly in the case of Tullamore, if I can get these buildings into my town will benefit hugely in terms of trade, hospitality, services, and so on, and at the expense of other towns that were benefiting from those services and so on. So in telling this story in the book, I focus on the big courthouses and the big jails in each of the county towns, as we still call them. But as such, the book has a lot about Daingean, then known as Phillipstown, and a lot about Tullamore. And I didn't really have space in the book to write about the smaller courthouses and prisons, the Bridewell prisons, for example, the petty sessions courthouses, the quarter sessions courthouses. But the research I did along the way indicated a very similar story in terms of power and patronage. As such, I'll focus mostly this evening on Daingean and on Tullamore, talking about the courthouses first and then the jails. And at the end, I'll say a few words about some of the smaller courthouses and prisons in Birr, for example, in Clara, Edenderry, formerly Moneygall, and other places. And these are all towns and villages I really enjoyed having a chance to visit over the last 10 or 11 years when I was researching this book. And so we start with this map, and the counties highlighted are those that built new courthouses at the beginning of the 19th century. Technically, those that built new courthouses in the 20 years between the Great Rebellion and the economic recession at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. In the late 18th century, in Ireland and elsewhere, the courthouse became a type of a building that was recognisable for the first time. So it emerged out of the old market house, the old Tulsel beginnings. Courts became more formal, they became more specialised, and architects responded with buildings, I suppose, that we now look at and say, that's a courthouse. That's recognisably a courthouse. This happened all around Europe and the Western world at this time. For example, there's been lots of studies of courthouses in US colonies, for example, the state of Virginia. Courthouses became recognisable there and elsewhere, and you start to see, for example, the use of a portico, the columns and the pediment in the front of a building, which for many now symbolise, throughout the Western world at least, alongside scales and the blindfolded figure of Lady Justice, the law and the legal system. As you can see, for Ireland in this map, many counties built new courthouses in the early 19th century. And in most cases, though not for Offaly, we know the name of the architect responsible. The new courthouse of this era in this county was built by the grand jurors who were then known as the King's County grand jurors, of course, in the county town of Daingean, or Phillipstown as it was back then. A much smaller town, of course, than here in Tullamore or Birr or many other places in the county. And this is, I suppose, the building from that time period. This here now a photograph taken around the year 1900. Well, I suppose an obvious question then is, was this courthouse built around 1807 or so? Was it about showing some strength after the Great Rebellion of 1798? Well, I would say maybe, but it was certainly about a local tussle going on in the county between the respective landlords in both towns, the Ponsonbys and the Burrys here in Tullamore. The Burrys wanted to move the county town here to bring up to gain all of the social and economic dividends that would come with it, while the Ponsonbys, of course, wished to keep it in Daingean. Tullamore was then, of course, being replanned after the fire of 1785, and there had been a petition to move the assizes here as early as 1786 without success. And I think building a new courthouse in Daingean shortly afterwards was a very clever way of making sure that it wouldn't move anytime soon here to Tullamore. When I was last in Daingean, I was very impressed by the little square that's been built in recent years in front of this building, and I hope that it has a kind of a good future ahead of it. I know these buildings are very difficult to maintain. This is one where we don't know the architect responsible, but there's a lot of influence of James Gandon in the design of it, and there's likely some connection, perhaps indirect, through another architect who was aware of what Gandon was doing. While, of course, this new courthouse in Daingean ensured the status quo would maintain for at least another decade or so, Charles Berry, Lord Tullamore here, continued to pursue the interests of his town, and in 1821 he secured plans for a new county jail at the edge of the town here that I'll discuss shortly. At the Spring Assizes in 1821, the presentment book, for which survives at the Cambridge University Library, where I was really thrilled to find it years ago, the commissioners for this new jail commented that, quote, however desirable it might be to also move the assizes to Tullamore, the courthouse at Philipstown or Daingean had been, quote, lately erected at very considerable expense, and as such the issue would have to be pushed down the road for a different day. Now, the foundation stone of the new jail here in Tullamore was laid in 1826. It opened in 1830, and I'll come back to it a little bit later on. Around the same time as this new jail opened, Charles Berry returned to the big issue of the assize town, and he won a vote at the Summer Assizes of 1829 to appoint commissioners for overseeing a new courthouse here. But the issue remained very divisive among the grand jurors. Later that year, he wrote, for example, to the Chief Secretary in Dublin, a man called Francis Leveson Gower, expressing his desire to adopt what he said were all the latest improvements in courthouse design. And he referenced in particular the courthouses in Gloucester and in Exeter. In Gloucester, Robert Smirke had built a new courthouse in 1814, 1816. This is one of the courtrooms photographed from the back. And architects Stowey and Jones had built a courthouse in Exeter back in 1774. Lord Berry probably saw these buildings while travelling back and forth between Ireland and England, as many landlords and politicians of this time did, of course. He asked the government then to authorise a loan for King County to build a new courthouse here in Tullamore. At the same time, the Ponsonby family in Philipstown launched their own offensive with a letter to Leveson Gower objecting to the transfer of the assizes and identifying a whole host of problems with the new jail that was then under construction here in Tullamore. Leveson Gower was somewhat kind of reluctantly then caught in the middle of a dispute between the two landlords of these two towns in this county. For Lord Berry here, the issue was clear, and in writing to his mom, he set out his plans in fairly plain, clear language. He said, "It is absolutely necessary for me to go over to Ireland and fight in person Ponsonby's relatives. I think it is a duty I owe our property, the county and myself, to spare no personal exertion to secure the success of a measure of such serious importance which I consented to undertake. The interests of the county, supported by all the resident military and gentry, must succeed against the jobbery of an absentee landlord and family, however powerful." So he's not really holding back anything. That's plain and straight what he thinks and what he wants to do. Lord Berry's orders of priorities here is quite revealing, right? So our property comes towards the front of this, the county, myself. In other words, he could see the huge financial benefit that would accrue to the town of Tullamore should the courthouse be built here. When he attempted to pass a presentment at the assizes amounting to over £11,000, a vast amount of money at this time period, at the Spring Assizes the next year in 1830, it was traversed, which was the expression for it. It was opposed. It was shot down essentially as a proposal by the Ponsonby family, and so the issue then remained deadlocked in around the year 1830. But later that year, he became a bit more optimistic, and writing again to his mom, he commented, I don't like tamely to submit to defeat. It would be a great benefit to the county, to Tullamore and the property, and the greater the difficulty, the more honour if we are ultimately successful. Leavis and Gower, who Birr didn't think much of, it's worth noting, once describing him as a drowsy, pompous, poetical humbug, had since been replaced by a different Chief Secretary, Henry Hardinge, who Birr thought was a clear-sighted man of business, so things were kind of on the up. And Birr was now confident he would be able to gain the, quote, entire and cordial support of government to remove the assizes to Tullamore. He acknowledged, though, that this was the first attempt, he said, to alter an assize town in Ireland, and it's next to impossible to discover in whom the authority and the right is vested. Hardinge is most anxious, as we are also, to avoid the necessity of an active parliament. Though the opposition will be strong in Parliament, I doubt the government being beaten on a local bill supported by the county members and persons connected by property with the county. Birr believed that the assizes would bring £500 in profit to the town of Tullamore each time they were held. So if the courthouse cost £10,000 to build, this sum could be charged off the county as a whole and not just off the town, but the payback would come largely to the town, and quite quickly and quite sizably. And with such an intense focus on the economic gains of bringing the assizes here, there wasn't really much concern and much reference in the correspondence to the state of crime, for example, in the county at the time. In other words, the plan to build the new courthouse was not really related in a kind of meaningful way to tackling crime or a show of strength or showing justice in the county. In fact, crime levels in Offaly had remained very steady in terms of like 3, 4, 5 year averages through the 18 teens, 20s and 30s. So money was a much more central factor here than crime at the time in the county. The benefit to the town of Tullamore was noted, for example, by an English soldier called George Calladine, who visited in 1821 and again in 1836, and who thought that in the meantime, the town had altered for the better, he said, having some new streets, a fine courthouse, a fine county jail, built since I was here last. The assizes being changed from Philipstown, he said, which was as much the other way, the barracks being empty, and half the houses in the town unoccupied and nearly falling down. In other words, when Tullamore went up, Daingean went down. And that's what he noticed on his 2 visits to the county in these years. Birr's belief that the change would require owning a local active parliament proved a little bit too optimistic. A year later, in 1832, he was forced to introduce a general public act in the British Parliament that attracted a lot more unwelcome attention as he feared that it might. With the support of the Parsons family in Parsonstown in Birr, Birr proposed the assizes should be relocated here to Tullamore. His bill was closely modelled on one that had been introduced the same month in the same Parliament to move the assizes in the county of Norfolk from Thetford to Norwich. And both bills were in fact discussed on the same day in Westminster. Ponsonby, as you can imagine, was hostile, as expected, to this move, but so too was another Member of Parliament, an academic from Trinity in Dublin called Philip Crampton, who you might see was maybe a bit more kind of a neutral voice in these years, although really there weren't many neutral people in politics then or now. But anyway, his view was that there hadn't really been a very sufficient case for making this change, and he thought that the building of a new courthouse would entail a very heavy expense on the county, and these were not times, this is 1832, not really good years in Ireland by any means, in which such burdens could be borne. It would appear that the new jail had been built with the view of affording an argument for removal of the assizes. In other words, this is all about local politics and local economics. But despite these objections, the bill was passed in a division in a fairly empty House of Commons, 50 votes to 38 that day, and it received royal assent on the 4th of July, 1832. Birr then had won the final battle in what had been a 50-year war. An architectural competition was staged later that year, with the entrants advised that the site for the new courthouse, which you all know here just to the southwest of the town on the 6-inch map, the site will be on land granted free of charge by the Birr family adjacent to the new jail on the road that goes from the centre of the town to Charleville Forest, to the family estate. And here the roughly January 1838 6-inch Ordnance Survey map for Tullamore showing Wellington Barracks, the courthouse, the jail at the southern end of the town. The lineup of these new big public buildings impressed visitors to the town, as presumably the Birr family had hoped. In later years, the railway station was added nearby, and some sense of how this appeared to people we can get a sense of it from, for example, the writings of the English artist Teresa West, who visited in 1846 at the beginning of the famine, and finding that this lineup of public buildings made for a dramatic entrance to the town, commenting that the road was, quote, rendered striking by the jail and the courthouse, two excessively handsome buildings in their several ways, the latter Grecian, they stand off the road on high ground. The overseers of this competition for the design of the courthouse had suggested that potential architects could follow the plan of Gloucester or of Kerry in Tralee, the courthouse there. Both of those seen, as they said, as good models for a new courthouse. By this time, the courthouse in Tralee, designed by William Vitruvius Morrison, was well under construction and was widely known through Ireland at this time, as I mentioned earlier. Birr was also at the time the MP for Carlow, and he would have been aware of the equally impressive new courthouse that the grand jurors there were also building, again designed by William Vitruvius Morrison. Of the many entries submitted to the competition here in Tullamore, only two, as far as I know, have actually survived for us to look at today. One by William Murray, who had trained with Francis Johnson, and one by John B. Keane, who had trained with William Vitruvius Morrison. Though Morrison himself submitted two designs to the competition, one Greek and one Gothic, neither were successful, and those drawings have not survived as far as I know, although lots of people would love to see them if they ever turn up anywhere. One of the most curious entries came from Birr himself, who prepared what he termed a Saxon design in the hopes that it would blend well with the Gothic Revival jail here in Tullamore. These drawings have also seemingly are long gone. But the William Murray design, which was not built, we do actually have drawings for it, and we have a sense of what William Murray was proposing. The main front of it, drawn in 1832, was largely kind of Italian in its style. Here is the front view of what could have been built here in Tullamore. A lot of influence here from the Italian architect Andrea Palladio, but also some Greek influences in it. A lot of things going on, to be honest, in the design. The detailing was slightly unusual, especially in the two blind windows on the ground floor, which were needed because of the arrangement of the rooms behind them, and the kind of slightly strange division of the main facade in different ways. I mean, it wasn't built as such, so I'm sure lots of other people at the time had their reservations about it too, whether on architectural or on economic grounds. But behind this kind of palazzo-style facade, Murray had a very peculiar plan for this building. And here the principle of having kind of semicircular or kind of curved courtrooms was maintained, following again what Morrison was doing in Tralee and in Carlow in these years. To do that, they kind of bulge out the back of the building, as you can see here in the plan drawing. And this would have been quite an ambitious building to have built in these years. There's nothing quite like it in Ireland from this time. I've tried here by adding some of the labels to give you a sense of how it would have been arranged. We also have surviving section drawings that show that the judges and the grand jurors were amply provided for in the design, echoing also courthouses in Kilmainham, for example, in Dublin, built some years earlier. The very large rooms for the grand jurors. That's often a very good tactic if you're an architect, because the grand jurors will decide largely which architect to go for, so you want to provide a building which will suit them as well. You can see here towards the right of this some of the quite grand rooms. In fact, it's marked there beneath the chimney piece, grand jury room, lovely big tall room overlooking the town and the street outside. For Lord Birr, it's not clear that he was actually too interested in the architecture of these different designs. He was interested in, could he get them over the line, money-wise? Could he make sure that it actually went ahead and happened? He wrote again, for example, to his mother. Here's one more of the side elevation. And the point here with this one is that it gives a sense of the entrances for the judges and for the grand jurors. And they have their own separate, very plush entrances to these buildings, as you find in the courthouse in Kilmainham. If any of you have been up to see the OPW, the site there now, the prison, of course, and the courthouse together, recently renovated. Back to Lord Birr, he wrote to his mum in January 1833 saying, "We have selected out of the competition a capital plan of courthouse as far as internal accommodation and convenience, but with Grecian elevation, which I fear will clash with the Gothic-style jail beside it, but I couldn't get them to give a decent Saxon, Norman, rustic or Elizabethan plan, and the Democratic Party runs so high that out of all the plans, all Grecian, we chose the plainest exterior, fearing a traverse at the assizes. Keen to get the most accommodation at the least cost, essentially, the plan adopted as built, he argued, accomplished that object, and if an Elizabethan elevation had cost the same, the ignorant, the vicious, and the radicals in these reform times would say Lord Tullamore spent public money in ornamenting his town and squandered and frittered away in pinnacles, carvings, to indulge in his taste regardless of the misery of the poor endured in paying the tax for it. The present plan is bold and simple." So I think what's going on here is that the Murray design, which was turned down, was too ostentatious for the politics of getting the courthouse to Tullamore, and so that they could enjoy the economic benefits of it being built. And the Greek style of architecture is, by its nature, quite pared back and quite simple in detailing. It doesn't mean that it's cheap by any means all the time, and you can get extremely expensive Greek-style buildings built in these years, but the perception of it being simple and plain was useful for getting it over the line in terms of finances in these years. And the architect who built the courthouse, John B. Keane, had a particularly kind of austere and plain style when he was building in using Greek-style architecture. And here, is that the plan of John B. Keane's courthouse. This was approved at the Spring Assizes in 1833. A loan followed later that year, and the Assizes were held in the building for the first time in the summer of 1835. Keane's design for the courthouse here in Tullamore was a combination of what Morrison had designed for Tralee and what George Richard Payne had designed for Cork City, for the Cork jurors that were jealous of what was going on in Tralee. Keane provided two semicircular courtrooms with a surrounding corridor that connected them with the great entrance hall, a host of rooms in the centre and offices to the rear. Instead of letting the shape of the courtrooms dictate the outside shape of the building, as in Tralee and Carlow with those great kind of curved walls, and as Murray had proposed for Tullamore, Keane kind of squared off the building, using the little awkward triangular spaces in the corners for rooms for witnesses and for the police, for example. The main facade is broad, symmetrical, and dominated by a hexa style, a six-columned Ionic portico with a blank attic behind the pediment. And there was, I think as many of you will know, a lion, shield, crown, unicorn and stuff on top of the pediment. These were all removed after Irish independence. This image from when they're still up there, this is an image that Michael let me include in the book. It appears that Keane had originally intended the facade of his courthouse here in Tullamore to be slightly closer to the Tralee design by Morrison than was actually built. And we know this because there is an elevation drawing labelled County Courts for Tullamore, signed by John B. Keane. Again, this is courtesy of Michael Byrne. And there's a slight difference, if you look carefully at it, between what we have built, which is square around the edges, and here where this elevation drawing clearly shows a building which would have had semicircular courtrooms, just like Tralee, just like Carlow, Actually, Carlow is octagonal, but it's the same principle, I suppose, on the inside. This one, I say, was not built. But I think that Fergal's drawing, Fergal did the one that's actually built, I think. I can't see it from here without my glasses, but anyway, many of you will know that Fergal McCabe had these drawings of the prison and the courthouse here in Tullamore. But this is another one that wasn't built, I suppose, this particular shape and design of it. So what happened to Daingean, or Phillipstown, I suppose, after all of this was finished? Well, it went into a huge decline economically after the assizes shifted, and all of the services, the hospitality, the food for prisoners in the jail, and all that went. For Birr and his family here in Tullamore, it was a great victory, and the building stood, I think, as a monument to their triumph over the Ponsonby family and to their success in introducing an Act of Parliament and in getting money to build such an impressive courthouse in what were very turbulent and economically dismal years of the 1830s in Ireland. And as it was nearing completion, Lord Birr contemplated building a large square opposite the courthouse, opposite the road, with landscaped features and attractive detached houses on three sides facing the new courthouse from across the road. He hoped to call the estate the Beaujolais, you have to tell me how it's pronounced locally, but the Beaujolais, who I think was his wife's maiden name. This, of course, was not built, but it was a kind of a fantasy that he had, and it would have framed the courthouse magnificently had it gone ahead. But these were not really years in Ireland for going ahead with big projects like that. One final point worth making about the building of the courthouse in Tullamore is that while it was being constructed, the architect, John B. Keane, was also busy building a new courthouse in the neighbouring county for the North Riding of Tipperary and Nenagh. The county there had been split into two ridings in 1836, with Clonmel, the assize town in the south, and Nenagh, the assize town in the north. And the courthouse in Nenagh is actually quite similar in terms of plan, in some respects anyway, to what's here in Tullamore. Again, a fine public building situated in the centre of the town at the end of what was then a new planned street. And there is an excellent book on all of the history of Tipperary in these years that some of you may know by Donal A. Murphy, called The Two Tipperaries, that was published coming up on 30 years ago now. In much more recent years, the courthouse here in Tullamore was gutted by fire, as many of you I'm sure will know, in 1922, and thereafter rebuilt under the watch of the architect Thomas Francis McNamara between 25 and 27. Around this time, the coat of arms were removed from the pediment, as in many courthouses in the Free State in these years. And in much more recent years, the whole thing has been very extensively refurbished by Newenham Mulligan Associate Architects, who've done, I think, a very good job of it. And this work was done, I think, was the mid-2000s, late 2000s, at the time when many big courthouses in Ireland were getting significant state investment. Well, what then about the building beside it? The jail, the former prison here in Tullamore. I mentioned it briefly along the way in the context of the dispute between the Ponsonbys and the Burries, but now just a few more comments on it. In the years when Tullamore Jail was being built, there were no fewer than 15 big prisons under construction in Ireland. And this was, I think, was a remarkable period of building, almost impossible for us to understand today. We have 6, 7 prisons, I think, in the Republic at the moment. There were 15 under construction at one time when the jail was being built here in Tullamore. A good deal of the impetus for building new jails in these years came from pressure from a charity group founded around this time, and they were called the Association for the Improvement of Prisons and of Prison Discipline in Ireland. They modelled themselves on a similar group in England and other parts of Europe, and they campaigned against poor conditions in jails, which were pretty much ubiquitous in these years. From around 1820 onwards, the Birr family were keen to push for the new jail here in Tullamore to replace the old one in Daingean. Conditions in the old prison there were appalling by all standards. The Association for the Improvement of Prisons reported, for example, the jail there was so radically bad that it was bad in execution and still worse in design. And the original plan provided abundantly for the disease of the mind, they said. The recent addition appears to have done so for that of the body. So they thought that this was a hopeless prison and in it there was no reformation of prisoners, there was no moments for exercise or anything else, just basically a dungeon that was being used for the King's County prisoners in those years. And keen to do something about this, but also of course to benefit the town here, the Birr family played a central role in forming a local committee of allies to progress the project, and this committee consulted with the Association for Improving Prisons and in time received several designs from them for new jails. One of those designs that has survived was by William Murray, the man who built or who designed the courthouse that wasn't actually built here in Tullamore. And the drawings for this do survive. What he proposed was a polygonal style jail. In these years there were two main types of prisons. There was this style, which is in shape of a polygon, and then there were the radial plan prisons that went out like bicycle tires from a central hub building, which is actually what was built here in Tullamore in time. This got nowhere. This was an early design. It wasn't adopted. The drawing survived, but that's pretty much it. You might, if you look closely, you can see that there's a flap that's kind of glued on in the center of the polygon, and that allows you to lift it up and you can see on a different floor what the architect had in mind. And you often get that in drawings of this time period. And it's amazing that it survived in such good condition in the care of the Architectural Archive up in Dublin. But not convinced by this design, the King's County Grand Jury Committee visited other jails then recently built or under construction, and they were especially impressed by what they saw in Limerick, which they took as their model. Here, an early drawing of the prison in Limerick. This is a jail which is still, of course, in use today. This was built by James Payne, and after much lobbying and delays, a series of loans from the British government arrived here in Tullamore from 1826 onwards, and the foundation stone for the Gothic Revival style jail was laid with great pomp and quite a few swipes at the Ponsonby family by the Birr family later that year. As Michael Byrne has chronicled, bonfires were lit here to celebrate the coming of a regular income to the town with the prison. And the Lord Tullamore at the time paid for, quote, pipers and fiddlers to play to the crowds and ale to be distributed, but warned that he expected there would be no fighting, no drunkenness, no broken heads, and no complaints from mothers, wives or daughters about the behaviour of their men the next morning. And that was the opening of a prison in Ireland in the 1820s. The reason they were celebrating was that it brought business to the town. That's fundamentally what it is, and that's so different, I suppose, to our view of prisons today. The jail here, opened 1830, was larger than the county actually needed at the time and provided enough division for different types of prisoners, different opportunities for inspecting prisoners, employment, activities, exercise, you name it. The new jail here in Tullamore was designed by an engineer called John Killally, and in it he clearly borrowed from what James Payne had done in Limerick. In the National Library in Dublin, as I mentioned earlier, there are some drawings that survive dating probably from the time of construction in 1826, and here showing a building very similar to Limerick, castle-like with heavy crenellations and metal bridges connecting the different radial cell blocks with the central hub. From the road there was much the same effect. Here a photograph from 1978 showing the jail. The engineer, the builders and the grand jury commissioners, most importantly you might argue, are commemorated in a plaque above the gateway of this prison. I'm sure many of you have been up to read this over the years. The metal palisade railings that go around the jail and the courthouse, these are a wonderful thing that survive in many cases. One wonders what impression they gave on the people that were being hauled through them on their way to courts or to prison. When I was last in Tullamore, these were largely there. Going by this evening, I think they've been temporarily maybe removed for conservation work, is it? Yeah, which is great. Which is great to see because it's very expensive and they need it. They'll deteriorate quickly otherwise. I know Carlow has similar railings. They're really fantastic bits of early 19th century ironwork, and super to see just driving by earlier that they're away somewhere being fixed up, I guess. Of the old jail here in Tullamore, not all of it, of course, has survived. Much was demolished some years after it was occupied and damaged by both sides during the War of Independence and then the Civil War. It was largely a ruin by 1922, and this quite dramatic 1930s photograph, kindly shared with me by colleagues here in the Offaly County Library, shows the state of it as it was also under demolition, I would imagine, in these years. This demolition happened, I think, in 1937 to make way for a factory on the site behind the wall and the gate. We often think, I suppose, of 19th century, of the kind of Victorian ideas of the romantic spirit, say, in literature or in architecture. For example, it would be hard to imagine today building a new jail in a Gothic revival or a castle style of architecture. But when I saw this photograph here in Tullamore years ago, I thought that the Victorians would have loved this, to see a ruined Gothic building as a jail that had been kind of smashed to pieces almost. They would have almost built it as a folly had they had the chance to do it. But anyway, just to finish off then, I promised before finishing the lecture I'd comment briefly on the smaller courthouses and prisons in the county. There were many, especially in the early years of the 19th century. Before going on to them, just a few more words about the old county jail in Daingean, then Philipstown, which of course became redundant once things got going here in Tullamore. The building in Daingean kind of lingered on for a long time, so you can see here on the left the 6-inch OS map from the late 1830s, and then on the right the 25-inch OS map from around the year 1900. The jail had been built adjacent to a barracks over in Daingean, roughly in the 1790s, and criticised very heavily very soon afterwards as a totally hopeless design for a prison, totally inappropriate for holding prisoners. It reopened in the 1850s as a site for receiving convicts on their way across Ireland for Australia, by and large, and for Spike Island, and for leaving the country on that route. And a prison structure of iron was built in the same decade for that purpose, which would have been quite novel at the time. It closed again in the 1860s. The iron prison was dismantled, and as you can see here on the 25-inch map, it then reopened as a reformatory institution for young boys, which remained in existence until the 1970s. That was St. Conleth's Reformatory. I think that is a place that has a very checkered, very dark history to it, long beyond its history as a prison. The original jail buildings are now long gone, but of course the big stone walls survive by and large that surround the site and give a sense of what it must have been like as a prison back in the day. Architecturally speaking, there's much more surviving material of interest in Birr, known at the time, of course, as Parsonstown. Birr was always an important town in the county. It's home to many renowned buildings, including, of course, the castle, the telescope, and so on. Very elegantly planned town, and up near St. Brendan's Church of Ireland is the former courthouse and bridewell. Here in a photograph, it was 8 years ago I took this photograph. I wonder what I haven't been back to it since, so I hope it's still there. The courthouse is visually similar to the one in Daingean to some extent, and it seems that it was built around the same time, roughly 1810. Particularly nice here that we have so much of the original character of the building, the heavy crenellations along the top, for example. The building was certainly in place in the time of the 6-inch OS maps, as it's marked courthouse and jail. To the left and behind the courthouse was the former prison, known for most of this time period as a bridewell, meaning in Ireland essentially kind of a small local prison. Though there were plans at various stages to enlarge this, it kind of rumbled along for much of the 19th century as a smallish and fairly poorly run bridewell, has to be said, here at the back of the building, often criticised by government inspectors. The opening of the big jail in Tullamore took some of the pressure off the building in Birr, but even then the government inspector's report for 1844 on the eve of the Great Famine was fairly damning. And I won't read out the whole thing. You can see below the reference if you want to look at the whole report by a medical doctor called Dr. Francis White, who died actually during the famine years of illness. But this is his report from 1844, where he said the prison very defective. The lower cells and day rooms appropriated to the male prisoners are very dark and badly ventilated, particularly the cells. The bedding is indifferent. The yards and privies are in a very bad state of repair. the latter are quite exposed and offensive. There's no sewerage to the privies, and the exposure which takes place in cleaning them creates a very offensive nuisance, particularly as the whole contents are obliged to be brought out in wheelbarrows through the house. So there's a sense of Birr's Bridewell in 1844, not a place you want to spend time in. By this time, the Bridewell in Birr was the only prison of that size left in the county, really. But if you go back a bit further to the 1820s, there had been very small Bridewells in Moneygall, Shinrone, other places to serve the southern parts of the county. Both of these were gone by 1826. They were shut down fairly early. They weren't really prisons too in the modern sense of the word. They were kind of in general like rooms in private houses where people were kept temporarily, lockups before they were brought up onto bigger prisons and to court. Architecturally, these have really vanished, seemingly without trace, though I'd be very glad to hear if there are in fact little bits and pieces around that I didn't see when I went looking for them years ago. In terms of smaller courthouses, to finish off the lecture, there were and there are courthouses throughout all the main towns in the county: Clara, Edenderry, Shannonbridge, Kilcormac, Banagher, and so on. The courthouse in Clara is, as far as I can work out, long gone, without a trace. In Edenderry, to the east of the county, the lovely early 19th century market and courthouse survives, elegantly placed in the centre of the town, which Andrew Tierney in the Buildings of Ireland guide surveyed and wrote about so nicely recently. Over in Shannonbridge, where the petty sessions were sometimes held, again, nothing, it seems, now survives. In Kilcormac, the same story. But often in this time period, courts were happening in the back rooms of pubs, for example. They weren't, the small courts weren't really distinctive big buildings. They were just happening informally, sometimes even happening in the drawing rooms of landlords. The 6-inch map for Kilcormac, or Frankfurt as it was sometimes known, shows a petty sessions house. Just see in the middle of the map there, it's marked on it that there was a petty sessions house in Kilcormac, but the exact location is hard to pin down from this map. Back west in Banagher, again, nothing now standing. Shinrone, again, the same story. So really, I suppose in this county, it's the big town, Tullamore, Birr and Daingean and Edenderry, I suppose, where we have surviving examples of courthouses and prisons from this time period. I'll just finish off again by just expressing my deepest thanks to Michael Byrne for his help over so many years. We've been in correspondence for, I think, about a dozen years, and we met for the first time in person today, which was lovely. And also to Ciarán McCabe and to the Society for the invitation to come here to Tullamore to speak about these buildings. I'm very happy to answer any questions. I'm also keen to listen and to learn. As I often find, speaking like this, there's huge amounts of local knowledge which I simply just don't have, and I didn't pick up as I was going around the country. I went to every county researching this book, and that meant rushing things at times, so I may well have missed out on something. So I'll open it up to the floor, really, and thanks very much. But please just shout away if anyone has any comments or questions.
The conditions in Tullamore jail, what were the conditions? I mean, was there central heating for the... I have an interest because my great-grandfather was in the jail there, and I know what he suffered, but I'm just wondering, was there heating there?
Yeah. From maybe the 1850s onwards, there would have been heating through these prisons. They were installed around that time period, burning coal to heat water for radiators by and large. There is an unbelievably huge body of material that you could look at for every year if you wanted to see exactly what was happening in Tullamore jail. So on this slide here, I put up just for one report. There was one report done every year. This is just for 1844, and this is how much text we have on the small prison over in Birr. But Tullamore, in this same report, is about 3 or 4 A4 pages of text this size about everything. What people were eating, how many spuds people were getting every day, conditions, books in the library, heating, numbers of different types of prisoners, from the very bad to the kind of very small crimes and everything in between. I read through all of these when I was writing the book, and was kind of overwhelming amount of material. And those reports are there for every year from 1821, 22 until Irish independence, pretty much. So you can follow through the whole time, and like reports today, they get longer and longer through the years. So by the late 19th century, the report for Tullamore, I think, is 30 or 40 pages on just what's happening in the prison. So, and all of these are online for free. That's the key thing. There's no access, no special logins or anything. Google Books has most of them, and you can word search them, and it's an amazing resource to have. These are the blue books. So some of you will probably know the old parliamentary papers that were scanned and put up online.
Thank you.
Yeah. There was another few comments and questions. Yes, please.
The attendance at the vote, 50 to 38,
Yeah.
is that remarkably small, I mean, compared to what we're hearing these days?
Yeah, so I suppose in this time period in Westminster there was 400 or 500 MPs. There's 650 now, but there were fewer then. But for Irish matters in Westminster, the turnout was always hopeless. And it was a sign of disinterest, to be honest, I suppose. So the issue of the prison in Tullamore was I'm afraid, was of minor importance to the MPs for London. They weren't going to turn up for it, you know. Yeah. I think there was a hand up there a minute ago. Yes, please.
Yeah, I was looking at about the time of the famine, before and after, and I can't remember the date for the erection of a capstan mill at the back of Cork Courthouse, or Parsonstown, Bride, whatever they call it.
Yeah, yeah.
A capstan mill by which the prisoners would attach themselves to poles, I suppose, walking around and around.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know how long it's survived the association for.
They were very short-lived. The question was about the conditions in the prison in what was then Parsonstown in the 19th century, and about the Association for the Improvement of Prison Discipline. That association was only going for about 7 or 8 years. It was a small group of mostly Dublin middle-class professionals, very Quaker heavy in terms of those that were interested in it, and that may well tie in with Offaly history in a way that I haven't looked into in detail, for example. But they kind of ran out of steam fairly quickly, and in some ways the government got more interested in prison conditions, and you start to get these annual reports that I was just talking about a minute ago. And as the government starts to do more and more of it, the charity starts to lose its purpose, I suppose. It achieves a huge amount in a short period of time. And when I came across them writing the book, there was next to nothing written about this charity anywhere before. And I thought, well, this is strange because this group they're in everything at this time period. How have they not turned up? I think the only book that they turned up in was one of Maria Luddy's books about philanthropy and women in Ireland, in Irish history, where she was interested in association because prison discipline was one of the things in this time period that middle-class women were particularly interested in. It was seen as something where you could go to Parliament as a woman and speak about conditions in prisons and make the case that what was going on. You get lots of stories that are told in certain ways to try and make the case. So I went to a prison and I saw a woman and 3 children on the ground, and they were talking to the worst male prisoner ever created, a multiple rapist, and this is morally appalling, and that conditions have to improve. That story turns up again and again as a way of trying to get some change. So in terms of conditions in the back of this prison, former prison, those annual reports will probably reference the installation of something for the exercise of prisoners. They're so vast, I couldn't tell you for sure if they're in them, but it's a great source of information. Where we have, because the reports are every year, we can actually date many buildings to the inspectors saying, since I was here last, they've added this to it. And at least then we have a firm date for it. Yeah.
Of course, the suffragettes were in Tullamore prison.
Yes, absolutely. The suffragettes in Tullamore Prison, and Tullamore Prison had lots of interesting people in it of different political moments. I haven't really spoken very much about that this evening. I was really looking at just the building of them and the politics of them. But the who was in them, to go back to your point too, is an equally interesting, fascinating story locally, I think, as well, and nationally. Yeah.
One from the Zoom.
Okay.
Are the records of the names of the prisoners in Tullamore Jail?
Are the records of the names of the prisoners who were in Tullamore Jail? They do survive, as far as I know. They're in the National Archives in Dublin, if I'm not mistaken. It wasn't really, I suppose, something I had time to look at because I was so caught up with the people who were building them rather than the people who were in them. But the registers are fairly good for most counties for prisons, and Michael, you probably know more than I do about that.
About 1865.
60 onwards.
The closure.
Yeah.
They're probably on Find My Past now.
They would be, that's right, yeah. I mean, 1865 is a kind of it's a year when records start to get very good in Ireland because of not just prison surviving ones, but also, as many of you will know, births and deaths start to be registered quite often from around then. So happy days for historians really from that time onwards. Most of my work was pre-1850 where there was a lot less to go on.
The other thing I should mention is the two large houses beside the courthouse were built in the late 1830s to frame the new building by a local agent. And ditto with the jail, there's a brick house opposite the jail currently for sale. And that was built also to set off the new building and maybe take away some of the cabins that were on that side of the street.
Yeah. Even driving through there this evening, there's a great sense of kind of 19th century improvement in the street, right? And the way that it's laid out, the buildings, the very, very grand buildings around it and near the courthouse and the prison. Having grown up in Bantry's a whole different. There's a lot less money, to be honest with you, in Bantry in this time period than there would have been in Tullamore, and you see it in the buildings and the arrangements of the streets. And these buildings they're part of that. They're part of the story of the rebuilding and the improvement of the town, and kind of the strong landlord hand on things. Where it turns up in Ireland, you tend to get these kinds of very nice results. In Bantry, the Bantry House family didn't really have the cash on hand to do anything very ambitious, for example.
Is there information about the source of the stone, the quarries, and how the stone was brought to the sites?
Yeah, so is there information is the question about the stone that was used in these buildings and the quarries, how stone was moved and so on. In general, yes, historians tend to rely on one particular book a lot for these kinds of questions, which is a book called Ancient and Practical Geology of Ireland by George Wilkinson, published in 1845, 46, around that time. Wilkinson was the architect of all the workhouses, as some of you will know. Also railway stations. I think was it Mulvaney here in Tullamore, or was it Wilkinson?
It was here, for good buddies.
But who did the railway station in Tullamore?
He didn't either.
No, I think...
Later, it was 1860s.
Okay, yeah, because it would have been the Middle and Great Western line, was it? Yeah. Anyway, sorry, we're off topic. But the George Wilkinson book, he built the workhouses, and there was an awful political kerfuffle about the whole thing because a lot of people wanted the contract to build them and didn't get the contract. And he got the contract as a fellow from Oxford, came in, got them all, built them all. And there were huge amounts of stories of badly built workhouses falling over, bad masonry, incorrect stone. People were lobbing all kinds of grenades at George Wilkinson for the workhouses. And some of them were badly built, but most of them actually weren't, as we know, because most of them are still standing today in use. And as a way of basically saving his reputation, he wrote a big scholarly book about geology to try and prove to people that he knew what he was talking about in terms of stone. And it's an amazing resource that we have because it lists every quarry then open in the country. It lists the types of stone used in all kinds of major buildings, the qualities of all the different stones. Does he mention Tullamore, courthouse and jail? I don't recall him mentioning them specifically, but he will have 7 or 8 pages of information about quarries in Offaly, at least in that book. And that's the starting point for questions, I suppose, like this. Yeah. That book is, I don't think it's up on Google Books. It wasn't last time I looked, which is a shame because it really should be. It's kind of an encyclopedia type book, really. But most libraries tend to have it somewhere. And it's well worth having a look through. There's even illustrations in it of different quarries, different types of stone, and so on. I've come across, dry stone wall builders who are not really interested in academic history. They're interested in building walls, I suppose, by and large. But they know George Wilkinson's book for its information about stone types. Now, have we exhausted? Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Butler. And I now call on James Scully to present a vote of thanks.
Would you like to take a seat?
Oh, of course. I see my own book there.
I'm bringing up a few books because I'm going to mention a few books. But, of course, primarily I'm going to talk about Richard's wonderful book. I had the pleasure a few months ago of launching Central Leinster, this other great book by Andrew Tierney. And I urged that night that you would keep it in what the Americans call the gun compartment, but what we affectionately know to be the glove compartment, now long gone. So it's empty, and I would urge that you keep this book in particular, and also this magnificently designed and illustrated book on the courthouses and prisons. I mean, you have no doubt, having heard that talk, the wonderful detail that is available in this. Look at that great story. We know everything now about the Phillipstown, Tullamore jail and courthouse saga. It's all there. This is a book worth keeping in your car as well. I was in the magnificent Heritage Centre in Offaly the other day, and I said, several people there, and we got talking about this, that and the other, and I said, are you enjoying Central Leinster? And they said, where is Central Leinster? I said, it's Andrew Tierney's great book, but they had not come upon that. Anyway, it's Lee Offaly and Kildare. I'm saying perhaps too much about that when I should be talking about this. This is a magnificently illustrated book, lucid and learned, and yet very gentle to read and, as you saw and heard, to listen to. Some of my favourite characters were turning up. John Killally, the great canal engineer, and that discussion between the Ponsonbys and the Charlevilles and Leverson Gower, that's mirrored again between the Charlevilles and the crowd in Kilbeggan, where they wanted to build a canal, and Gower gets caught in the middle there in a rather precarious sort of a way. I'm very sad and regretting that Murray's wonderful Palladian vision wasn't built. Wouldn't it have been lovely if the Beaujolais, or Beaujolais, or whichever you wish, had been built opposite to really enhance the whole thing. But you're right, just coming in this evening from Banagher and coming back to Tullamore, that's a lovely sweep as you come over the railway bridge. And the prison and the railings temporarily gone, but the magnificent portico and the jail, despite what's gone, still looking very formidable and very impressive. So another echo there was the reference to Quakers and concern for prison reform. It's Stephen Callahan's, several of his blogs and in some of his talks he talks about the poor soldier. Is it William Juby? Juby is marched that little bit too much, so he begs for leave. He goes and gets his rifle and shoots the sergeant major, handing over the gun. And while he's awaiting his trial, it's the father of the Goodbodies in Clara, who befriends him and brings him books. And I think that that's an interesting story in itself. So, I love the wonderful personal insights that we got, military and artistic. And as I've said, again, that little story about Juby. So all in all, it has been a wonderful presentation. It's a really wonderful book. Buy it. It's only €40 or less, I think, wherever I got it. And if you haven't got Central Leinster in your car, they're great. To me, they're companion volumes, and I would strongly recommend that you do so. And I would strongly recommend that you show your appreciation for Richard and his wonderful presentation tonight.
Thanks very much.